Good evening. You're very welcome to this edition of Ireland's Generation X, a series that focuses on the group of artists born between 1965 and 1985. We're delighted, as always, to present Ireland's Generation X in partnership with the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm the director here at MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, on St Stephen's Green in Dublin. And though our museum doors might be closed at the moment, hopefully not for much longer, we have been busy working behind the scenes on new exhibitions as well as our digital and learning programme. So you can check out more on that work at moli.ie. This evening, we are joined once again by Professor Barry McCrea, a novelist and a scholar of comparative literature, who will be in conversation with one of Ireland's most celebrated writers and poets, Nick Laird. Nick's recent poetry collections have been published by Faber and Faber, and his most recent publication, Feel Free, was one of the most well-received poetry collections of recent years. Before I go, I'd like to let you know about two other events hosted by MoLI this week. Tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be hosting our monthly Directors Book Club at 5 p.m, which is free for MoLI members. We'll be reading Megan Nolan's new novel, Acts of Desperation, and I'm delighted that Megan will be joining us for the hour in conversation. Then on Friday at 7 p.m, we celebrate the launch of Nuala O'Connor's new book, Nora, with the writer in conversation with Catherine McSharry, the Deputy Director of the National Library of Ireland. So I do hope you will join us for that and clink a glass from afar. Finally, if you enjoy this evening's programme, I would encourage you to buy MoLI membership, either for yourself or a friend. It really is the best way to support the museum and its programming at this time. So you can visit moli.ie/membership to find out more about that. With that, I'll hand you over to Professor Barry McCrea and Nick Laird, and hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you everybody for coming. Nick, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So the idea behind these conversations is mostly to get a sense of how writers and artists think of themselves, or even if they don't think of themselves, are part of a specific generation. And I was thinking, there's a scene in your most recent novel, Modern Gods, in which a mother, actually she's a grandmother, goes up to the attic and roots around, and she finds an exercise copybook written by one of her
sorry, my phone.
Not at all. So the character goes up to the attic and she finds an exercise book, a copybook from one of her daughters when she was young. And there's an exercise for English class in which the little girl has written a short story from the point of view of the town they're from, that as if the town is talking. And it made me think that this is something that comes up in your work a lot, the sense that people and place are not fully distinguishable things, or at least they're not easily distinguishable. So maybe you might tell us about your place. You're from Cookstown and you're born in 1975. So maybe just tell us something about the social and cultural landscape of the world you grew up in.
So Cookstown's always described in the promotional literature as nestled at the foot of the Sperrins. So it's a smallish town. It was about 10 to 15,000 when I was growing up, right in the middle of Northern Ireland. The hub of the north, Portadown calls itself, but actually it's Cookstown. So we kind of ended up there randomly. My dad worked for the Royal Insurance in Dublin. He's from Ballyshannon in Donegal, and he got posted up to Derry. And then whenever he left the Royal, he opened a business selling insurance, and he had some clients in Cookstown. So he just ended up there. And my mother's from South Armagh, Mount Norris direction, but her family were all from West Cork, Ballydehob. But Cookstown is where I was born, and went to Cookstown nursery school and primary school and Cookstown High School. And so it was always my town. I did go back a lot. It's a market town founded in the 1600s, and it's not a good looking town. You couldn't say. It's a pretty brutal place. A long, hungry Cookstown, they call it. It's one big long street. But it was a great place to grow up. You had a bit of freedom. I was from the countryside outside it, and just spend the days wandering around forests and fields and rivers and burning things and digging things and all the rest of the stuff. So I loved it there. Yeah, I mean, it was a good place to grow up, and it gave you a real sense of place in that way. It wasn't Belfast. People, as soon as I sort of got out, everyone would talk about Northern Ireland as if it was Belfast. But we, in Tyrone, we were west of the Ban, very different place with sort of very different interactions between people.
So I suppose when we're talking about Northern Ireland, we can't avoid the topic of identity. And you're right there in that little biography you gave. Even if you didn't know from your name, you'd know that you were a Protestant from the names of the schools you went to. So I'm thinking about identity not as something that is inherent or something internal to you, but as your first sense of a kind of collective orientation in the world, maybe the first sense of yourself as belonging to a broader collective matrix. What kind of identity was available to you there or given to you there?
Well, I mean, growing up in Northern Ireland in the 80s and 90s, going to a Protestant school, we were in Mid-Ulster, had a terrible sort of spate of tit-for-tat killings, as they called them. So, I mean, there was a lot of bad stuff going on all the time, obviously. And I had a good friend, Davy Harkness, who got blown up at a T-Ban. Him and I worked together in a bar from when I was 14, and his sister owned the bar. And I'd worked with him for years, and he was working on a roof at Omagh police station, and then in 1992 in the T-Ban bombing he was killed, and my girlfriend's uncle was delivering bread in Dungannon and he got shot dead by the IRA. And so there was a lot going on, and at that stage you definitely retreated into your kind of tribal identities. It was complicated for us because, I mean, my dad was Irish, we had Irish passports, always considered ourselves first and foremost Irish, but certainly wouldn't have declared that at school. And really, you kind of retreat from politics. Excuse me, you kind of retreat from any discussion of that or any sense of it. We were technically Protestant, but we were Church of Ireland. And as you know, Church of Ireland's just about Protestant. So it was more to do with the received narratives you were getting from the church and the state, and this kind of reaction, I suppose, to the death and carnage all around you. You did kind of want to stand, shoulder to shoulder with the people who were getting killed. It's hard enough, actually, for me, whenever Martin McGuinness became my MP, it's complicated. I do think of myself as Irish, and I have a wee cottage in West Cork, and I go there every summer, and most of my family still lives in the Republic, my extended family, but it's hard for me to be in America, particularly where Irishness in America tends to be synonymous with the Republican element to some extent, and that is complicated for me. So yeah, I mean, identity is a funny thing, and in a way, really, that's why I suppose I fell upon poetry with a kind of relief, because growing up in Tyrone, you do get given these narratives from the church, the state, your school friends, your peers, the news all the time. And poetry was definitely a space apart from that, like a space to have kind of considered reactions to things. And that voice speaking in those poems, whether it was Longley or Mahon or Heaney or Yeats or whatever else, incredibly intimate space. The poem, this kind of transmitting of personal intimacies one-to-one, and kind of shorn of all those contingencies of religion or sex or race or class or nationality. So it was definitely something that opened the world up to me in some way. Like it was a way out, a way of sidestepping those narratives of Catholic, Protestant, nationalist, all of that.
So those writers you just mentioned there, because they're all Irish, and all except Yeats is Northern Irish. Was that was your encounter with specifically the Irish literary tradition or the Northern Irish literary tradition? Was that a particularly liberating encounter as a way to move from, I suppose, what you might call your given identity as a person to your created identity as an artist?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there were no books in my house growing up. My dad didn't go to college or anything, and the first time I sort of encountered poetry really was at school, and I think we did Yeats when I was 14 or so, and then but it was really Heaney, Death of a Naturalist, when I was 16. We got given it for GCSE, and it really was about the world outside the door. You know, it was Balahi's only a few miles from Cookstown, and coming to Heaney, I was like, oh, well, this is something that is also open to me, I suppose. And then from that, there wasn't a bookstore in the town, but one Saturday a month we would go up to Belfast, and I would be dropped at the Waterstones in Castlecourt, whatever it was, at 10 in the morning, and then my parents would pick me up again about 3, and I would just sit down in one of those wee wheelie stools, you know, with the rubber tops, and just sit there all day and just read through the poetry section. So I'd save up and buy like the New Younger Ireland Poets or the Penguin Book of Irish Poetry edited by Mahon. I just was sort of accumulating all these things, and then one thing leads to another. You know, you encounter the next person who kind of blows your mind in a new way. But it certainly started with Irish poetry. It was a book, it was Heaney's Government of the Tongue, actually, which was in my school library. And I think it's the only thing I've ever stolen, but I didn't give it back. And I just read through that, and through that book, you just come to people like Sylvia Plath and Elizabeth Bishop and Zbigniew Herbert and Auden, people I wouldn't have met otherwise, you know. And so that was a kind of doorway, a gateway book for me into lots of other things. I can't remember your question now, Barry, sorry.
I can't either, but one thing struck me while you were talking is that the childhood you describe, you know, digging and burning and running in fields on the one hand, sectarian violence on the other, and then consumption of poetry on the other, it does sound very like Heaney. And I wonder what you think, just going to our theme of Generation X, what the difference, especially for an artistic sensibility, there is between a Northern Irish poet of your generation, or writer of your generation, and Heaney's.
Well, you know, very different formative experiences, I suppose, and also different being a Catholic, of course, in the 60s in Northern Ireland than it was being a Protestant in the sort of 80s. You know, hard to put it exactly, but I definitely felt maybe my community was a little bit under siege from sort of the West Tyrone Brigade, who were doing a lot of killing at that time. And you know, we didn't really even talk about it in the house. Like, just every night you'd turn the news on and there'd be a new score of how many dead or who'd been blown up or whatever the thing was. And that was it. That was the way things worked. But, you know, oh, God's sake, sorry.
Somebody really wants you.
Somebody wants me. I don't know how to unplug this one. Anyway, so, but we would go up to my nana's in Ballyshannon at the weekends, and you know, had a kind of Irish existence, but the thing was complicated. Like, you had to kind of compartmentalize things, and you didn't really want to get into a discussion of it. Things did change after the Good Friday Agreement. You know, I even noticed it with my parents, that there would be a lot more interaction between the groups. Like, you know, my parents would be having people around for dinner and they were Catholic, and that didn't really happen when I was growing up, even though my parents would have been Irish, but everyone had kind of pulled back into themselves. So I don't know. I mean, Seamus's upbringing is obviously in all of those poems, and in a way, because Seamus had written those poems, like, you can't write those poems, you know, you have to try and find new ways of doing things. So I think it's the same with everything. You try and strike out in a different way. But I didn't stay. Like, I haven't lived in Northern Ireland really since I was 18. And I teach at the Heaney Centre now in Belfast, so I'm back now and then. But a lot of it's done, you know, online. And yeah, I don't know.
Well, one quick thing before we just moved across to the next part of your life. But one quick thing is I've always envied Church of Ireland people for the beautiful liturgy they get growing up. You know, the Book of Common Prayer is, we get these very bland translations. But I don't feel that idiom, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't feel that idiom has been, is very, at least not very overtly present in your work.
Well, I don't think that the idiom is present, perhaps, but certainly part of the interest in language does come from sitting. You know, there were times when my dad was church warden, we'd have to go to church twice on a Sunday, and big drafty empty church, Derry Lauren it's called in Keough-Naughton, and you just, whenever you'd hear those kind of fabulous thick biblical words like Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, or Nebuchadnezzar, or whatever it was, a wee light bulb goes on. You know, I think if you're interested in language, and certainly part of the recital of prayers does seem to me similar to poems, something about ceremony, something about ending properly, something about putting thoughts in order. It's not unrelated.
But then you went to study law. You went to Cambridge, but you started off by doing law. Is that right?
Well, so I initially applied to do law. I hadn't been to England even at that stage, and my school applied me to Cambridge. I think I was going to go to Queen's, and then they had a fella 5 years before me from Keough-Naughton who'd gone to a college at Cambridge, and they decided it'd be a good thing for me to apply. So they just picked the college, and I applied. And my dad was very keen for me to be a lawyer. You know what it's like if you're from a small town and you're halfway clever, you're either a doctor or a lawyer, maybe a teacher. But that was the plan. So I'd done work experience with the local lawyers in Keough-Naughton and started off, applied for law, and then my English teacher came to visit my mother and was very keen for me to do English, and I kind of wanted to do English anyway, so changed to do English. But even when I was there, I would keep meeting people in the town, and they'd say, "Oh, your dad said you were studying law," and I'd say, "Well, sort of. I'll probably do it afterwards." So after I graduated, the deal was that I would become a lawyer then. So I went to did a conversion course and studied law in London at the College of Law, and then worked for 4 years as a lawyer. So, I mean, I think quite good training actually for a writer in lots of ways, particularly a novelist. Seems to me constructing an argument, taking a lot of information, finding out the salient bits, you know, putting it into order, persuasive, all that stuff.
I mean, Dickens got a lot by hanging around the law courts himself. That was, but so how tell us about becoming a writer then? How that process, because your first novel and your first poetry collection came out in the same year, I think. Is that right? Yeah.
So I was writing them I was writing even when I was working in the city of London. I would write at lunchtimes or in the evening, and I just never stopped writing. You know, people say, when did you become a poet? But all kids write poetry when they're 4 or 5, but I just kept on doing it. And for whatever reason, a way of processing stuff, I'm still doing it. So I took a sabbatical. I went to Harvard with my partner. I think I met you at Harvard, Barry.
There was another Barry who was lucky enough to go to Harvard. No, that was the Harvard Barry.
Where did I meet you, in Rome or in Harvard?
I can't remember. Maybe.
Anyway, so, and then went to signed a contract for the poetry book and the novel, and then went back to work as a lawyer and tried to finish them, but just didn't have the time. I was working in litigation. I was working on interesting cases, like I was working on the Bloody Sunday inquiry and the fox hunting inquiry and large-scale commercial stuff. But I knew if I really liked the law actually, and litigation sort of appeals to me, being a bit argumentative and thran. But I knew if I didn't leave, I wasn't going to finish the books, and someone else could do the law, but no one else was going to write books about Keough-Naughton.
Well, so on that, so I'm sorry to harp on this this topic of literary traditions and artistic identity, but how did that sense of yourself shift then from being a young man, a young boy in Keough-Naughton reading Heaney, and then going to Cambridge, where you had this, I suppose, very high octane encounter with the English literary tradition, and then London and the law, and how did your sense of yourself as a writer and I suppose not exactly the tradition, but I suppose the kind of imagined community that you were working inside change, or did it?
I never have felt part of any community, and I don't say that lightly. Like I genuinely haven't. I've always felt kind of on the outside. I mean, it's not true, obviously now, really, because when my first book came out, Seamus was kind enough to drop me a note, and we became friends, and I would have seen him, and you do feel kind of welcomed into something. But certainly, as a sort of apprentice writer, I was never part of anything. I never went to any writers groups. Never did anything. Just sort of reading and thinking and writing by myself. Cambridge was strange because in Northern Ireland, never felt quite Irish enough, and then you get to Cambridge, and then you're not English. People think you're Irish when you're there, and it's all a process of estrangement. I did find Cambridge very difficult. Like I was very homesick. And you're meeting a lot of sort of public school boys who are incredibly confident, and I just didn't know anything at all. I remember writing what I thought was an essay and getting a note back. I think it was the first week when I was there, saying this is not an essay, and I thought I've a way to go here. So head down and studying, but I mean, really a tremendous training going to somewhere like Cambridge. They really put you through it, and you do have to read and write and think. And it was a pleasure for me then I did my first thesis, my first sort of dissertation on McNeice, and then I did my last one in my third year on the role of walking in Heaney, Mahon and Longley. And so I knew what interested me, and it was a way of trying to bring these new sets of skills that you're learning, about literary criticism and thinking about poetry. It's a way of bringing them to the stuff that you had all around you when you were growing up. But I never felt part of Cambridge poetry scene or anything. And in fact, at Cambridge, I'd sent some poems to the guy, Rod Mengham, who's a sort of part of the Prynout School, and he sent them back and said, I can't help you with these. So then I sent them to Edna Longley at Queen's. I'd never met her or anything, but she sort of very kindly sent me an encouraging, but fairly, she didn't pull any punches, let's say, letter, which really was incredibly useful. Most of it said all these poems are twice the length they should be. So that was useful.
I suppose I was thinking when I said community more of dead writers, your sense of connection, the way when Joyce went to college and read Dante, right. He thought, oh, finally somebody who's my equal who can is there but I suppose you've answered that, I suppose, in the fact that you ended up writing on McNeice.
Yeah, well, McNeice had, I don't think McNeice was in any way similar to me, and the odd thing is, I think if you're a Protestant in Northern Ireland, people somehow put you in with Anglo-Irish writers, but I mean, I'm not Anglo-Irish. I don't know anything about England really, and I hadn't been there until I went to Cambridge. But McNeice had a complicated sort of connection with Ireland, and he's an absolutely fantastic writer. So he appealed and had a way of sort of dealing with some of the stuff, especially in Autumn Journal, just felt very current. The stuff about the Troubles, not the Troubles as he called it, but the section 16 of Autumn Journal, nightmare leaves fatigue, we envy men of action who murder and intrigue and do not beg for pardon, all that stuff. It seemed completely contemporary to me. So he was an interesting figure. And at that stage, you could kind of write about him fitting into the 30s generation with Auden and, Spender and Cecil Day-Lewis. So yeah, there was him. I don't think of myself as part of that community of dead writers, I suppose, but only by dint of reading those people and writing back to them or answering them. But I suppose the big writer that I haven't mentioned was Muldoon, and his work. We used to drive through the Moy every Saturday when we were going to see my granny in Mount Norris if we went up in Donegal, and I knew the Moy well in college lands, and so Paul's work was speaking to the other side, really. Keough-Naughton is sort of equidistant, weirdly, between Balahi and the Moy. So I sort of felt like they were both kind of interesting. I don't want to say precursors because they're twice as poets I am, but like people to read and people to think about.
Your voice is very distinct from either of them, and I think you can feel in your work the transatlantic movement, a bit in images and idioms as well as everything else. But I spent I was just telling you there before we came on, I spent the Easter weekend reading your prose and your poetry together, which was an interesting experience. And there are a couple of recurring themes, as it seemed to me, or preoccupations that I wanted to just throw at you. I know it's a dangerous thing to do because you might just bat them away, but there is a recurring motif of doubling. I mean, siblings seems to come up a lot. There's the two brothers in Utterly Monkey and the two sisters in Modern Gods. And in both cases, there's one person who stays at home and one person who goes away. And I suppose, and this seemed to me different to Heaney, which has there's a lot about departure and return in Heaney, but in fact, you don't have departure and return. You have departure and non-departure it kind of exists simultaneously. And that made me think that was connected to another preoccupation I saw in the poetry about time passing and roads not taken and the inevitability. There's an extraordinary image in one of them. I can't remember it now. I should have written it. We're shot into the future at the blistering speed of 60 minutes per hour, something like that.
Oh yeah. I'm time travel into the future at the blistering speed of 60 minutes an hour or something.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a lot, and there's a lot of linear imagery like that. I wonder, does that make any sense to you? Is that a preoccupation?
I think I suppose I had to write the strapline. I mean, Utterly Monkey is 2005, so I can barely remember what's in it. But I do remember writing the strapline for that novel. And it was something like, "You leave home, but home follows." And definitely, I think whenever Joyce was traveling, or even Heaney was going, leaving home meant you left home. You might, if you went to America, you might come back once or whatever. But that changed for my generation, not just with the internet now and stuff, but before that with telephones and long haul flights and everything else. You did stay in contact in a different way. And Northern Ireland, has its hooks in you in various ways. It is hard to kind of get out of radio contact to some degree, and you always, as soon as you're back, you're back in it. So I never felt that I was away, partly because I never stayed in one place when I left. I think there was I was moved to Warsaw for a while, and then I was in Rome for a few years, and I was in Boston, and then I was in London, and then I've been in New York for the last 10 years, and now I'm in London. So home was always the place, Northern Ireland. There was nowhere else. So I always felt that I was going home when I got on the plane in Luton or at Fiumicino or wherever it was. I was going home. So I don't know. It's sort of been the kind of center that I orbited around. Yeah.
I mean, it's obviously it's done in a very realistic way and a very sensitive way as well as being funny one. But in the book, in Modern Gods, somebody literally travels all the way around the world to arrive in a place called New Ulster.
Yeah. So there is actually a place called New Ireland. It's an island off Papua New Guinea, New Ireland, and yeah, it's maybe a bit broad, but yes, I changed it to New Ulster. This Dublin idea, it is this sort of the looking glass that we can, make of art and see ourselves in. I am sort of interested in that idea of the path not taken, of what you find, when you go away. And certainly one of the things about going to Cambridge, for example, was this new perspective on Northern Ireland. Like what a strange place to grow up in, and that it doesn't seem like that when you live there or you are there. But what's the Joyce line? The quickest way to Tara is via Holyhead. So getting away from it allows you to see it clearly, and definitely that was true for me in some regard. It's sort of farcical. Northern Ireland, it's still the same. We've just had 5 nights of rioting in Northern Ireland. There's like 30 police officers injured. It's it's a crazy place. But when you're in it, it doesn't seem that crazy. At least it seems crazy, but not farcical, let's say.
But quite a lot of the doubling, as far as I can see it anyway, is connected to ambition as well. And there's one poem that really struck me. It's a very funny poem in Feel Free, called Team Me. And the title must be a phrase you picked up in the US, I think. It can only be.
Team Me? I think I made it up.
Well, it's very convincing. But in it, the poet meets something like his younger self, who is also the personification of his ambition and his sensitive ego. Is that right? Is that
Yeah.
how I understood it?
Yeah, he's wearing like a Christmas cracker hat from
Yes.
Christmas 1983 or something, isn't it? Yeah, bat fangs, bowl cut. Yeah.
But it just made me think that the kind of the the idea that you travel half around the way around the world and you ride the new Ulster just seems to be a psychological truth too, that you travel very far ahead in time, but there's always a little guy with pointy teeth and a paper hat from 1983 sitting opposite you.
Right. I mean, the problem, it turns out, is you. That's the
Who'd have thought?
Yeah, you can't escape yourself. So I suppose there's that in it. I don't know. Like, I'm 45 now, and the poems still come as a surprise. But I suppose the general kind of tenor of them is that, like, in the end, it is you. There it is. The poems are sort of all ways of trying to come to terms with being yourself.
So there's one last topic I'd like to ask you about before you read something for us. And it's about children and childlessness, that also comes up both in the prose and in the poetry. Somebody who doesn't have children myself, the poem on not having children, I find extraordinary. Also a painful poem. It has very sharp edges to it. But it's a topic that comes up again and again, paternity in children. It seems to be a topic that is very alive for you in a poetic way. Is that right?
Like, maybe. I'm not sure that I have that much sort of self-knowledge to. So that poem on not having children was written for a friend of mine who is one of my oldest friends. He's a gay guy that I grew up with and was best man at my wedding, and lives in London now. Does it have sharp edges, that poem? It's about doggerel, isn't it? About how some words don't rhyme. The thing about, I suppose, being a parent is that you spend a lot of your time having to do really boring, silly things or stupid things. And I was thinking of doggerel as that kind of poetry. These Dr. Seuss, books or whatever. This very full-on rhyming stuff, and how that, in a way, the rhyme itself was sort of like having kids. I'm not explaining it right. The poem does a better job, hopefully, but yeah, I
take it more as being about the fact that some things don't lead anywhere. They just occur and stop, and which is neither bad nor good. But the poem just evokes the shape of those kinds of things that can't be woven into a ballad or a book in the Bible where God isn't mentioned. These strange things that just occur and are just, I suppose, once-offs.
I think I was interested in trying to write a poem that seemed like a collection of splinters. The lines sort of stand alone, and sort of are unrelated almost towards the end, and then hopefully it starts to draw more clear what the poem is trying to work towards. I'm interested in trying to go into, I suppose, a slightly difficult area in a poem like that, and trying to say something true, not without being sort of sentimental or silly, or I don't know.
So that the time is going really fast. So you're going to read something for us. So you can either introduce it if you'd like, or just go straight into it.
So I was going to try and read something new, but the only new thing I have is the sort of bad thing we haven't talked about is that my father died 3 weeks ago from COVID in Antrim Hospital, and I couldn't see him, and we couldn't go into the hospital. We couldn't bring him home or have a wake or anything, and even the cremation was just my sister and I at Roselawn in Belfast with 10 cousins standing in the car park watching a video screen of his coffin going to the furnace. So it was pretty brutal. My mother died 3 years ago. She was young, she was 67, of cancer. So my dad had been on his own and sitting in Keough-Naughton just waiting for a year in lockdown. And, you know, he's like the guy who gets shot after VE Day or whatever. He seemed at the end of it, but so he died. So I've written a sort of poem. I was going to read it out. I've already, maybe it's a bad idea, but anyway, we are here. It's sort of 8 or 9 pages. So wee sections. I'll sort of maybe put my hand up to mark the section. I've never read it out loud before, so bear with me. I already sent it to a magazine to publish because I sort of needed shot of it. I needed to pass it on, like the black spot in Treasure Island. You know, I needed to get rid of it. So something to do with discharging it, with sharing it. And apologies for the seriousness of the enterprise. Will I just go ahead, Barry? Up late. If I shut my eyes to the new dark, I find that I start to experience time in its purest state, a series of durations rising and dilating beneath my inwards gaze, each instant coming at me like a mass of shadow erupting blackly in blossom, like a jet of time, where the mind is held aloft, alone, jostled and spun like a ping pong ball. My father died today. Sorry to bolt that on. You understand the shift required? This morning, the consultant said, your father now is clawing at the mask and is exhausted, and we've thrown everything we have at this. It's a terrible disease. He promises to give him morphine and that a nurse will be beside him at all times to hold his hand and talk him through it being the transition, the change of state, the fall of light, the trade, the instant of the hand itself turning from the subject into object. No, we are not allowed in the ward and there cannot be exceptions. Thank you for making this difficult call. But I know what the body wants. Continuance, continuance, continuance at any cost. But dying then, as we speak, my father in the IC ward of Antrim Area Hospital, the IC ward, the ICU, ICU 2. On Sunday, they permitted us to Zoom and he was prone in a hospital gown strapped to a white slab. The hospital gown split at the back and the pale, cold skin of his back was exposed. He lifted his head to the camera and his face was all red, swollen, bisected vertically by the mask, and we had to ask Elizabeth, the nurse, to say his words back to us. He sounded underwater. It's been a busy day, but not a good day. I could see even with the mask on, your little satisfaction with the phrase managed out. And the achievement left you so depleted, you lowered your head back to the slab, having done with us. Like some seal on a rock looking up as we pass on the blue pool ferry out to Garinish. Dad, you poor bastard, I see you. You lay like that for a week alone with your thoughts in the room, tethered, breathless, undefended. The eye adjusts, even to darkness, even to the presence of what overwhelms us. And as I make my way from the bed to the study, the soles of my feet on the carpet warp it as any fabric made of this space-time will distort beneath the force of a large object. And my father, as it happens, is gigantic. And if you thought an understanding could be reached, you are wrong, for it could not. The goldfish pilots the light of itself through a 10-gallon darkness, and I keep watch as the large hand of the clock covers the small and leaves it behind to the weak approximation I sit here in and finish writing. I want the poem to destroy time. What are the ceremonies of forgetting? There is a spring in Boeotia that lets the river Lethe enter our world. King Jucky's ale of forgetfulness, excessive phlegm. But I like the notion of the angel lightly tapping the baby in its soft hollow above the top lip, erasing all the child knows. all its grief, all its terrible regret, before it descends again fresh to the world. After your stroke, you were born once more as smaller, greyer, softer. And after Mum died, left bewildered, adrift, ordering crap online and following the auctions, the horses, the football, the golf, but hungering for company, for anyone, sending money to that Kenyan who was younger than me and flying out to Germany to see her, and again, before Jackie arrived on the scene, the bottle blonde who had her demons, by which she meant she was a violent alcoholic. But with Louise, things seemed steady enough for a few months, before you got stuck in one of your loops about her ex-husband funding her and the changing plans of her ingrate daughter. You could never let anything go. A trait I also suffer from and kind of admire, but it's not a possibility here. The tick of the clock is meltwater dripping into the fissure. The minute hand clicks across the hour hand and hovers for a minute exactly. And impinging on the vision is your slack, wild face, and the way a nurse's hand might hold your hand or try again to lift your hand, but your hand now will not respond. I have been writing elegies for you all my life, Father, in one form or another, but now I find the path is just this game trail through the forested mind, which I must follow in the manner of an animal, a deer, a fox, a chimpanzee, returning to the clearing to nuzzle the corpse, to lick its nape or bite it softly, to look away and look again and wait for a response. One hand on the clock holds the other for a minute before going on alone. It is death that is implicit in the ticking. One must negotiate the next moment. The mind will not stop, and certain things are good to think with. Goldfish, carpet, clock. I want something fit to mediate the procreative business of redoubling the brittle world and settle on an image for a second. Since it is a given that the mind will keep returning to the magic, the legerdemain, the trick. One hand holding your hand as it turns into an object, as I turn back along the track towards the fold, towards the corner of the field where the father's body lies, and with an animal's dumb clarity, do grief work. Kiss your hand and kiss your cheek and leave my forehead for a time pressed against yours. When I phoned the hospital this afternoon to say goodbye, though you were no longer lucid, Elizabeth the nurse held the phone against your ear and I could hear you breathing, or perhaps the rasping of the oxygen machine, and I said what you'd expect. I love you, Dad, and I want you to keep on fighting, but if you are too tired now and in too much pain, then you should stop fighting and let go, and whatever happens, it's okay. I love you. You are a good father. The kids love you. Thank you for everything. Then I hung up and seen. Impossible to grieve and not know the vanity of grief, to watch oneself perform the rituals that take us. Automaton of grief, I howled, of course, by myself in my office, then sobbed for a bit on the sofa. An elegy, I think, is words to bind a grief in, a companionship of grief, a spell to keep it safe and sound, to keep it from escaping. There are various ways to memorize. Plato calls a mnemosign. My grandfather Bertie liked to tie a knot in his blue handkerchief. My father wrote in biro on his palm. I cannot leave the poem alone. Do you remember the pure world? I remember it from being a kid, always at stake in that place. One moved through it sideways, through forests of time, lost in them, and had to be called back to the moment. Infinities growing in stone, in moss, in the hay shed, the rain, the wind, in the darkness under the cattle grid. Rilke says of the pure, unseparated element, someone dies and is it. It's after 2. You're dead by now, I hope. Who thought to write that? But there's no hurry now, no effort, no need to call. You might be only sitting in your red chair, endlessly flicking through the channels. When I asked the doctor, Andrew Black, he said, it could take minutes, it could take hours. And I see you slumped, not sitting up, propped against some pillows with your eyes closed, something in you finally given up, defying gravity. Some obedience to objecthood settled in you now and set up home, set in stone. Outside on the motorway, the headlights of the vehicles are necklaces of diamonds, double strung, and trailing westwards alongside them, the necklaces of garnets. Dad, I cannot stay in the room with you too long in my mind. It is too hard. I thought there would be futurity. I thought things would happen. Nothing major. Barbecues? Why barbecues? God knows. You're walking around Bantry at the Friday market in your shorts in the rain, your white tube socks pulled tightly up, and a bright t-shirt from some Spanish golf course tucked into your shorts. By the way, we are even, you and I. No need. Look, how absolutely still the room is. Outside, the widowed sky has grown huge with stars. The Milky Way meandering like the Ballinderry, though the night has come with work to do. It sits with you and broods. It wants you to come at your own pace, and at the next moment, you might get up and speak clearly to everything. Creation, extinction, infinities rising within you. Alistair Laird is dead. Fuckity fuck, fuckity fuck, 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 fuck. My dad is dead. Bad luck. The light breaks and the night breaks and the line breaks and the day is late assembling. Rows of terraced houses are clicking into place. Clouds decelerate and make like everything is normal. The children wanting porridge. Voices forcing pattern out of circumstance, pitching rhythmic incident on little grids of expectation, satisfaction, disappointment, this new all. And walking to school, at the corner where the halfway house is, leaves animated in the briefest circle by the wind. That's it. Sorry, Barry.
Oh, that's an extraordinary piece of work that you've wrought from an unbelievably painful situation. It's extraordinary piece of work. Thank you for it.
Yeah, I should have read some short funny poems. Not that I can write short funny poems, but
no,
anyway,
it's an incredible poem. It's an incredible poem with these short words for a long time, and then built out. It's extraordinary. We have questions coming in, so we'll go to those. But thank you again.
Yeah. It's funny, Barry, since you mentioned time and Dublin, all through that poem is time and Dublin. The kind of the Dublin of making metaphor, really, which I suppose is always a sort of way of apprehending the world in a different way. Anyway, sorry. Yes, Barry.
Well,
yeah.
This image of the clock hands that comes up a few times is really marvelous, and then on that I see it's connected to this poem you have in Feel Free about the father's hand and the cigarette, Silk Cut, I think it's called.
Yeah.
But enough from me. Let's go to the question. So, do you think that travel and the perspective that travel brings is essential to a well-rounded writer? An interesting question.
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe. I don't think it's necessary. I suppose you could think of people like John McGahan or people who seem to not really go anywhere but know everything. So, horses for courses, really. I think some people it helps, some people it doesn't. But then you have someone like Joyce who only wrote about the place he left, So I maybe is the answer. I'm just going to stick the light on.
Yeah, I mean, Joyce is certainly a New Ulster situation.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of compliments for the poems. Margaret Kelleher. Hi, Margaret says, thanks for your generosity in reading this elegy to us. Your words will linger long, and deep condolences on your losses. There's lots and lots of people commenting on the poem.
Oh, thank you.
But there is a comment from Mary. What the body wants at any cost is continuance. As my mother died 7 weeks ago, I recognized this. So there's a question. The poet must always be the conscience of the world. famous quote, how can a poet survive these absolutely inhumane times of nowadays? So how does a poet survive our times?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. I've had to kind of block most ways of the world getting at me, like the newspapers, and I listen to Radio 3 all the time, and it's become so intense. I remember growing up, my dad would like read the newspaper, and that was his way of interacting with the world for the day. But since all the channels are open 24/7, it's become really difficult. I don't have a smartphone. I've never had one. But even I find myself carrying the laptop from room to room, just aimlessly, what do they call it, doom scrolling. So you have to try and hold it off, I think, because it doesn't leave any space for thought. You're just constantly receiving information and not trying to process it or, turn it around and make something creative from it. I've just got to the stage now where I have I'm in my shed at the end of the garden, and I leave my laptop in here when I finish work, and don't, because I need to be away from the world. And the internet seems to have ruined everything, but it certainly seems to have ruined our capacity to concentrate. I can't read novels in the way I used to, so I'm trying to do that again. And one of the ways is not to bring any, way of interacting with the world into the house. It pulls you, if you have your phone or your laptop in the room, there's some part of your brain that's always sort of attuned to it. So I try and create physical distance, and I have a thing called Freedom that comes on every day, blocks the internet, but so the world is very bad, but the world has always been very bad. What has changed is that we're constantly in connection with the world. And I'm not like, climate change is obviously a new thing, but yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. But just try and make space for yourself, and don't allow the world and the algorithms and the news in all the time.
In addition to freedom, just since you bring it up, I use something called a lockbox, and my brother gave me for my birthday a few years ago, which is it's a timed safe. I turn my phone off and put it inside, and you get 3 hours. And it's when you're not near a device or able to access one, it's like the most precious, miraculous gift that you can be given. It just feels like you have superpowers. It's an incredible feeling. I agree. Do you think that this is a question for me just on that, do you think that the job of the writer, and maybe specifically poet or novelist, is different, has changed now? Or is it something that it's always been difficult and complicated and just continues to be so? Or the teacher of literature, I should add, in that list.
The teacher of literature, I mean, we talked about this, you and I talked about it off screen, but it's become harder to think about craft, not linked to content now, and certainly, the internet has, it's become harder to talk about poetry, I think, in particular, as being about these sort of transmitting of personal intimacies, and something about social media which is all about these sort of stridently identified selves, based on sex or gender or race or nationality, and poetry that isn't like that. I don't think, like when I read Dickinson or Whitman or whoever it is, Sappho, or I'm connecting with something very personal and intimate between the two of us. And I think those things have kind of maybe bled into each other, and not in an entirely helpful way. So I think trying to get back to one of the ways I found that has made it possible for me to teach in America is to take all the names off the poems that I show my students. And that kind of bewilders them a little bit, because they don't know what to think of the poem or how to approach it if they don't know, when it's from or who's written it.
That's a top tip, I must say. That's what I might use. When do you read? I'm just curious. I ask everybody this, but like, what parts of the day or week do you read? When does that happen?
Just sort of all the time. I have a lot of student work on at the minute, and I'm doing other like script work. So, but at night, I try and read at night. But also, I'm lucky enough to, not have to work a proper job. So I read during the day when the kids were at school. If they go to school, they just went back and watched I've been homeschooling for a year basically. So yeah.
So Catherine would like to know what magazine the poem will be published in.
It'll be in Granta. Yeah.
And there's a question from Matthew. How do you feel about the notion of writing a poem and letting it make sense to the writer over time? Does this chime with the idea of trying to find out something new about oneself each time?
Yeah, it does. And actually, there are certain poems that I've only sort of figured out what they're about after they've been published. And then you maybe notice something about it. There's a poem in To a Fault, my first book, and I noticed I think it's Cuttings, the first poem in the book, which is about my father and I going to the barbers. A fella called Adrian McCahey in Cookstown used to cut our hair. But I realized that the poem sort of goes out in these metaphors from a very small thing to a very large thing, and stuff that's completely unconscious that you just sort of notice afterwards. So I am interested in that kind of process of revelation in the work. I don't kind of want to write, or I'm not terribly interested in other people's poems that are telling me what I already know, or just sort of repeating things. I do want it to be a kind of space of exploration. Something surprising has to happen. If something surprising doesn't happen for the writer, it doesn't happen for the reader either. So I do want that, and if you're lucky, you find it. But you got to wander around for a long time.
And on that topic, then, can I ask you if you notice anything about the evolution of your own style as you get older?
Not really. I don't. So the way I've always worked is, because poetry has always sort of been, I don't mean a side gig, but I don't sit all day and try and write a poem necessarily. I collect. I'll have loads and loads of files on my computer with little tidbits, little words that rub together in an interesting way for me, and I'll write them down. It might be just a phrase. Berryman talks about the cough, the odor, the chime. So something will have sort of made some kind of interesting little impression on me, and then I'll write it down, and then I tend to come back to it and try and work it up into something. But I've always done that. It's rare that the poem will come whole, by itself. It's always a kind of process for me of endless revision and fiddling around with it and seeing what happens, and things coming in and going out, or the poem being, some half of it will be chopped off, or I'll merge it with another poem. Or it takes me a long time. I'm a slow worker.
You do have, as good poets always do, you have an eye for images, especially images that sort of turn the world upside down, and they come up in the poetry, of course, but they come up in your prose too. There's a couple in the novel. There's a description of somebody peeling an apple that is, I remember it says fluently is the adverb, but there's a description of the way the coil gathers underneath the apple, that it says the apple is producing a green coil or something. And it seems to me a very poetic way of inverting what's happening, because one would usually think that something's been taken away from the apple skin.
As you say that, Barry, fluently, I'm thinking I nicked it from a Muldoon poem, because doesn't he say fluently peeling an apple I think it's in the Weepies, he's Will Hunter fluently peeling an apple. So it's entirely possible it's stolen.
But the bit that I was actually complimenting you on was not the stolen goods, luckily, though it was the other bit. And then there's another one about the spider being the host, I think, in the attic. There's just a very fleeting image. I know this is a very big question to end on, but I feel that those kinds of images that seem to have meaning inherent in them are different in a youthful writer, and not that you're not youthful, we're the same age, but they take on a different resonance as a writer grows older. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it was something that I felt very much reading it this weekend.
Thank you.
We can leave that as a comment, maybe no more comment.
All right. Oh, sorry. So, the spider being the host, I suppose that's interesting to me. Is a kind of discombobulating image, an image that reverses the thing. So the idea of somehow the spider being the host and you the intruder, that is interesting to me. Something that casts everything in a new light.
So actually, just remember, we're at our time. Thank you very much, Nick, for the conversation and especially for the poem. It was a real privilege for us. And I would just like to tell everybody that our next event is on the 5th of May when I'll be talking to Katrina Lally.
Thanks very much, Barry.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Take care.